Hi there. Thank you for joining us. This is Connected Conversations, Thinking Differently About Design, part of the OAA 2021 conference. And today we've got a great conversation for you with participants and viewers from all corners of Turtle Island across its ceded and unceded territories. This session, Connected Conversations, Thinking Differently About Design, we'll explore approaches to design thinking that have been shaped by lived experiences directly. And though you don't have to have opinions about the design process and the built environment to have an influence on it, our trio of speakers today have both opinions and a direct understanding of how a shift in thinking can change design. With these talented speakers, we will explore why the concept of the body should be redefined in our profession to allow for a truly universal approach to design, gain insights into how an Indigenous placemaking framework could be used for any building or placemaking design, and discuss new approaches to design thinking through the lens of inclusivity and neurodiversity. Together, we'll discuss if new approaches to design thinking can cause social innovation to create the change we want to see in our community. And we have three wonderful speakers for you today. The first of which is going to be Annie Boivin, who is joining us. Annie, who's joining us, I believe, from British Columbia today?
That's correct, yes. And
so we'll give you a little bit of an intro on Annie. So Annie Boivin began her journey through the architectural practice in 2003 at Laval University. She then moved to the West Coast to attend the University of British Columbia, where she completed her master's degree in 2011. Upon graduation, Annie started her professional career at Perkins & Will, where she still practices today. In addition to her work as an architect, she also contributes to conferences, webinars, including this one, and teaches a design studio for the undergraduate program at her alma mater, UBC. Having lived with a disability all her life, Annie's unique perspective on matters of universal design is greatly sought after by her peers. She has contributed to numerous articles dedicated to accessibility and the built environment. Most recently, Perkins & Will, in collaboration with Canadian Architect Magazine, celebrated her introduction to the Architectural Institute of British Columbia, the AIBC, with the publication of a magazine article dedicated to her story. And we'll hear a presentation from Annie today, which is going to be followed by a brief fireside chat.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. I've been asked to present to you my experience as a designer living with a quote-unquote disability practicing in this profession. But I'm going to start with a small confession. I actually really struggle to engage in conversation about accessible design. Now, you might think it's a bit ironic considering that, as I mentioned, I'm both an architect and someone living with a disability, which in theory should make me quite qualified to discuss this topic. And I guess to a certain extent it does. But still, I really struggle engaging with this conversation. So I thought about it for a minute, trying to figure out what the issue was. And I concluded that my challenge actually comes from the fact that the current discourse we have around accessible design in our practice seems to revolve around a concept that, in my experience, is incorrectly defined. That is the concept of the body. So as a result, no matter how well-intentioned we are in addressing issues of access and inclusion, the solution we end up with never seem to quite achieve the ambition of our goals. So what I'd like to do with you today is take a closer look at how our profession currently defines the body and accordingly addresses the notion of disability in the built environment. And by ridding ourselves from some of the misconstrued ideas embedded in the definition of the quote unquote disabled body, and embracing a characterization of the body that's closer to its true essence, I'm hoping we'll be in a better position to attain the breakthrough ideas that we really required to achieve a truly universal approach to design. Now, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive historical account of the events that have led to this point in time, otherwise I'm going to lose you. But if you bear with me for the next 3 minutes, I do believe it's important to acknowledge the historical context from which we inherited most of the beliefs currently associated with the quote-unquote disabled and able body. First, let's remind ourselves that for most of the 20th century, the notion of disability was actually conceived under the recently acquainted term of medical model. Per this model, the concept of disability arises from a biomedical condition. It links a disability diagnosis to an individual's physical body and supposes that the disability may reduce an individual's quality of life. Its aim is, with medical intervention, to diminish, correct, cure, or manage the illness or disability that is afflicting the body. Under this model, the body is perceived as being ill, limited, or as the source of the disability. So I'm just going to repeat that for you quickly because that will come in later in the presentation. So for the last, century, more or less, we've been thinking of the notion of disability as the body being ill, limited, or as the source of the disability. More specifically, in architecture, the definition of body as a concept was, as we all know, largely influenced by the theories emerging from the modern era. By using the tools of the Industrial Revolution, modern thinkers were able to reposition design from the very exclusive world of the elite to the larger realm of the mass, which was wonderful. Regrettably, however, their intellectual breakthrough could only be as sophisticated as the tools it was based on. And in this case, unfortunately, the tools heavily relied on standardization. Most notably, the work of Ernst Neuffer in The Architect's Data, first published in 1936, soon followed by Le Corbusier's Modular in 1943, both represent an attempt by our profession to promote an idealized version of the body rather than embrace its reality, which is plural. As a result, the body is unfortunately rationalized, mechanized, objectified, and described through a series of dimensions, which are nowadays synthesized through the science of ergonomics. Although the 20th century saw tremendously positive advancement in the built environment, our predecessors' inability to develop an accurate representation of the able and disabled bodies led to some misconstrued ideas, which unfortunately still informs our current design methodology. I mentioned them briefly earlier, so let's go over them once again. The first misconception I noticed tends to infiltrate our conversation around accessible design is the idea that the disabled body is somehow limited. Now, that's not exactly a misconception, as the disabled body is indeed limited, but rather that the disabled body is the only body that is limited, that lives with limitations. Of course, as we all know, that statement would be incorrect. All bodies have some kind of limitation. That's exactly why we do not build housing underwater, but do tend to integrate vertical circulation systems to multi-story buildings. We're well aware that humans cannot breathe underwater or fly up to a tower, no matter how much Red Bull one may take. Even though contemporary practice has embraced some of the body's limitations, others have yet to make their way into our design process. So what exactly distinguishes between the two? Well, the second misconception we're about to address might give us a sense of where that distinction occurs. The disabled body is ill or needs to be cured. Now, this belief may not be as explicitly stated in our discourse, but it is implicit in many of the design solutions we're currently promoting. It most often manifests through the adoption of the standardized body and perpetuates the idea that any human characteristic falling short of the expected ones is deficient and thus does not need to be recognized by the built environment. On the contrary, it is the user's responsibility to compensate for their own shortcomings. Now, this displacement of responsibility from designer to user denies us the opportunity to come up with design solutions that acknowledge authentic human diversity. Furthermore, it reinforces the third misconception we're about to consider. Under this third misconception, the body on its own is understood as being disabled, regardless of its context. A wheelchair user, for instance, would be described as disabled merely based on the fact that he or she cannot walk. This belief can relatively simply be challenged by the following demonstration. Let's give it a try. Paul is nearsighted. Without his glasses, Paul cannot do anything. Luckily, his glasses correct his vision back to normal acuity. John, on the other hand, cannot walk. Fortunately, he has access to a wheelchair, which allows him to move around seamlessly. Now, even though Paul and John both have to deal with atypical attributes of the human body, and both use aids to assist them in navigating the environment, only John would be considered as being disabled by our profession. Now, why do you think that is? Well, a simple answer would be that the concept of disability does not actually originate directly from the body, but rather from the confrontation between the body and its context. So in other words, as long as John's body is not confronted by a set of stairs, for instance, of any other kind of obstacle that would prevent him from engaging with his environment, he is, much like Paul, perfectly able. Unfortunately, the inability of our profession to recognize and address these erroneous beliefs has allowed for the development of a design methodology that systematically discriminates against a large portion of the population. The notion of systematic discrimination in contemporary practice might make some of you frown. It makes me frown. Obviously, no one likes to think of themselves as being discriminatory, but unfortunately, when it comes to the design of the built environment, most of us seem to be oblivious to the role we play and the responsibility we have regarding issues of discrimination. Now, this is not ill-intended, but it is something I've witnessed too many times over the last 10 years, and I'm sure you all have too. And I'll gladly discuss this with you during our Q&A period. Now, 20 years into the 21st century, we're no longer bound to previously established models of disability and are far past the limitations of the Industrial Revolution. Having entered the digital era and gained access to tools such as computational design and digital fabrication, we're no longer restricted by the economic benefits of standardization and are permitted to expand the definition of body from a very limited set of data to an actual infinite number of possibilities. We're in a position to not only focus on expected characteristics, but rather celebrate humanity in all of its diversity. My wish is that we choose that as our legacy. Thank you.
Annie, thank you so much for a really powerful presentation. And I think I was particularly struck by this notion of obliviousness that still pervades in the architectural community. I think, as you mentioned, nobody would really wants to see themselves as being part of a discriminatory problem. No one wants to think of themselves that way. And indeed, I think that in contemporary architectural practice, everybody at least superficially agrees that accessibility and inclusivity are good things. And yet, much of what architects do, much of how the built environment takes shape is still predicated on those old assumptions, even if we don't recognize them as such. But I think what really stood out to me as being such a clear example in your presentation was the notion of a person with glasses versus that of a person with a wheelchair. Both require some accommodation in order to experience the world fully, and yet only one of those is thought of as a disability. And we treat those two very differently. So I wonder if, at the risk of oversimplifying it, from an architectural standpoint, as practitioners, how do we create more glasses?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, definitely. I think that's the challenge we're facing, is that it's not as simple to recognize the reality of someone living with, you know, a disability such as a wheelchair user, for instance, as it would be for someone that only simply needs glasses, right? So the complexity, or let's say the involvement that it requires from an architectural point of view is different, obviously, when you're thinking about someone that has a physical body that is so different from the standardized body, right? The further you get away from the standardized body, the harder it is to recognize that reality in the built environment. And so, I mean, I don't know that there's I don't know that there's a simple solution to it. That's why what I'm really trying to do is move the conversation away from, you know, trying to address disability as a separate category, right? We have this tendency to segregate currently in our approach to design or approach to addressing the human body. We segregate, and segregation is not necessarily something negative. I just mean that we put into categories, right? We have the human standard body, and then we have the human non-standard body, and we're addressing those two things sort of in parallel. The downside of that is that segregation can very often lead to discrimination, because all of a sudden there's more representation in our practice. For instance, there's way more representation of the standardized body. So it's way easier to address those needs and recognize that reality than it is to address the need of the non-standard body, right? And so if we can manage to get rid of the categories, right? If we just forget about the categories and we just accept the fact that we no longer need to think of the body as the singular thing that we're addressing, and then we're kind of accommodating anything else. Like if we think of the body as this range we need to address, that to me is intriguing. I think it's part of the solution, right? It's part of the solution. It's probably not the entire solution, but I think that would move us in a direction that I think would lead to better solution, rather than keep on going to this kind of segregationist approach, right? And say, you know, there's going to be an accessible approach and there's going to be just a standard approach.
I think that, you know, that really resonates with my experience of just as a journalist touring a lot of recently completed buildings and a lot of architecture, where the designers will take you through their thought process. And so often you get this idea that here's the circulation, here's how the building is experienced for the standard body. And then even if the project is fully accessible, a sort of secondary circulation exists as exactly as you're saying, I think sort of as an afterthought for other bodies, for non-standard bodies. So I think that even it sort of manifests itself on that really basic spatial level, that the entrance for one group of people is here and the entrance for the other group of people is on the other side.
Over there, yeah. Yeah.
So I think at least in those small ways, it really is permeated through the built environment. One of the other things that struck me from your presentation was the rapid evolution of technology, which means that from a practical standpoint, designers are able to move away from these economic assumptions about the need for standardization. And I wonder, just throughout your practice, how that's evolved over the years and where the industry is now.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see how digital fabrication or computational design mostly has really revolutionized the way we do things, at least in our studio. It's much more integrated to our design practice right now, but it is not really necessarily thought of. I think it's mostly used as a tool for currently sustainable design, right? Sustainable design is a big trend, and it has been a dominating trend in our industry for a long time, or for the last at least few decades. So we're using the tool for, to kind of facilitate our work. And I think sustainable design is interesting like that, in that sense, because it does require us to kind of handle a large amount of data, right? So climate conditions are not, they change over the year, for instance. They change from one day to another. And so our buildings are trying to recognize that this kind of, this ephemeral nature of the weather condition, which is kind of similar to the body, right? The body is it varies a lot. So I think the tools are there. They're integrated to the practice. We're more and more familiar with them, more and more comfortable with them. But I don't think that we're challenging the notion of the body, which is really, it's something we've just adopted, right? We think of the body a certain way. We've been thinking about it for a very long time, the same way. And so that's what I'm trying to challenge to a certain extent, right? What if we were to think of the body differently, and how can those tools really help us? And the example that you saw, which is a library at the, I'm going to forget the name. It's a design school. The reference is in the presentation. I can always send it around, but it's a beautiful example of how they created these little reading nooks, but on a wide kind of range of shapes and body shapes, accommodating. So there is one in there that accommodates a wheelchair user. Have you even noticed?
Right.
You probably haven't, because the variety is so kind of,
because it just blends in with all the others in terms of its variety.
Exactly. So it doesn't stand out as like, oh, there's 3 options that are standard, and then there's this other. It's like all of these options are not standard. They exist on a spectrum. And I think that's interesting. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating how you create the comparison with climate and the environment, that we've sort of in the design profession come to an understanding that the climate and the seasons are varied and something that we need to work with rather than channel into a static force. Yeah. And yet we haven't yet en masse started to apply that same type of thinking to the human body. But hopefully, at least with the combination of that sensibility towards sustainability and the type of technological advancement we're seeing in design, we can move the profession in that direction.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
And on that, I think we are going to connect into the next of our connected conversations. So we've spoken about the body, and now I think we'll move into the realm of the mind with our next speaker, who is Mark Fairbanks. And Mark has quite a varied bio. Mark leads a team of education and professionals at Islands of Brilliance, an early workforce development program for youth and young adults on the autism spectrum. Students are matched one-to-one with design and tech professionals, allowing them to showcase their creative thinking, learn professional design software, and develop critical social communication skills. COVID-19 necessitated a pivot to a distance learning platform, which resulted in unprecedented growth for the organization. Islands of Brilliance now has students from around the United States, enrolled in all 3 layers of programming access. The inspiration for the program originates with his youngest son, Harry, who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum just before the age of 3. His TEDx talk, 13 Years on an Island, traces the personal story behind the creation of Islands of Brilliance. Prior to Islands of Brilliance, a 27-year career in advertising, design, and digital saw Mark working for notable creative boutiques in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and Chicago. He was a member of the Creative Alliance, a cohort of notable agency creatives and agencies working on social impact initiatives during the final 2 years of the Obama administration. Mark also currently serves as the social entrepreneur in residence at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Lubar Entrepreneurship Center, devoting time to working with undergraduate students on design methodologies, business model canvas, and thinking through prototypes of their ideas focused on social innovation. When not occupied with his works in the community, he finds expression and mindfulness while tending to the urban prairie that welcomes visitors to Fairbanks' family home in Shorewood, Wisconsin, where he's joining us from today. And during the summer months, you can find him manning the Ferrari red wood-fired pizza oven in the backyard as he continually hones his Napoli-style skills as a pizzaiolo. Mark, that is quite the resume. When we do this in person, we'll try some of that pizza.
There we go. Thanks for the wonderful intro. Wonderful to be here to talk about my favorite subject, Islands of Brilliance and Neurodiverse Creativity. You actually, gave a great background of what I do, so I'm just going to skip through this, other than the fact that I do want to show off my pizza making skills. So I spent the majority of COVID learning how to make the traditional Napoleon style or Napoli style dough, which takes 24 hours to rise, and then create the pizza overnight. So if you're ever in the Milwaukee area, look me up, and we'll enjoy a slice together. I want to start out first with a word, autism. And if you have a notebook and pencil or pen down, I want you to write down what you think of when you hear or see that word. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that, and we'll come back to that later. But I want to talk to you about, I looked up the statistics in Canada, which are slightly different from the US, where the prevalence rate is now listed at 1 in 66 for children between the ages of 5 and 17 in Canada. That's the prevalence rate for autism right now. The unemployment rate is very similar to the US. In Canada, it's 86%. That is, just a remarkable number. And in the US, it's 83%. So when you think of the economic impact and the human impact that has, it's just astronomical. And so when we look at things like that, with that type of rate, we really need to dive into systems thinking and design thinking to come up with solutions to address that issue so that we can provide pathways to employment and independence for this population of individuals. This word neurodiversity has been used more and more. You might have seen it and become more familiar with it. It was really first championed by the autism community. help as difference rather than disability. And we just, hearing about that, thinking in terms of neurodiversity, and then having it become part of the DEI conversation when it comes to employment is one of those first steps in trying to change the dynamics around that unemployment rate. So neurodiversity, now you're reading more about it as a competitive advantage. Global companies like Microsoft and JP Morgan Chase and SAP in Europe have started initiatives to hire adults on the autism spectrum to do things like software testing and software development. And they've seen competitive advantages and productivity levels in these employees who are on the autism spectrum, leading to, faster turnaround on deployment and things like that. And this is a really great development in the last few years, that now autism and neurodiversity is seen as an advantage. But that's just one part of the narrative, and we need more narratives, and that's what I want to talk about today, because I want to talk about neurodiverse creativity. So it's not, where that is about productivity. Let's talk about the actual thinking, the ability to think different. If you're wired differently, you're going to think differently, and that's been my experience. So in the intro, I talked about my son Harry, and here he is, just before the age of 3, and he had, the classic signs of autism, and we had him, go through the diagnosis with neurologists, and part of that was he was identified with PDD-NOS, which is on the autism spectrum, which we never argued with. But as many parents on the spectrum will tell you, neurologists don't stop with the diagnosis. They actually give you a prognosis. And it was essentially lower your expectations. So he was not even 3 years old. And what they said was, he's not imaginative, doesn't understand the beginning and end of a book, won't be ready for first grade, don't plan on him going to college. So you can imagine the emotions you have as a parent with your child. You're already struggling with, what does this mean for his independence, for his life? How are we going to deal with this? And the emotion that this conjured in us was, my wife Margaret and I, is like defiance. And we basically said, we'll determine, he will be ready for first grade, and we'll determine what he's capable of. And that was it. There's no roadmap. There's no help from there. We were kind of left to figure out how best to get Harry to communicate and learn and become educated. So like many children on the spectrum, generally have a very narrow and deep interest. And with Harry, it was Thomas the Tank Engine and trains. Like that was basically his entire day, either watching videos, playing with wooden trains and things like that. And we were very lucky to have early intervention education with Harry. And the educators impressed upon Margaret, you have to get him to communicate, and that's the way to unlock his behaviors and help him learn. And it was difficult because he wouldn't make eye contact. He had very limited vocabulary. Margaret was an actress at the time. She's now a special education teacher. She's the co-founder with Islands of Brilliance. So she figured out, like, I have to improv. I have to go to my audience. So one day she got on the ground and started talking to the trains. Hey, Thomas. And that's when Harry made a connection with her. And she figured out that if she made learning about his subject matter interest, that was the way to get him to spend time on that. So reading, math, all these different subjects were all centered around trains or Thomas the Tank Engine, and he would spend more time and eventually made kind of incremental gains in his, not only his social skills, but education skills as well. So around the time he's, this is when he's 8 or 9 years old, I began to notice that he's using technology a lot, but he's using it more in a consumptive nature. He's on YouTube watching stop motion Lego videos and things like that, but he's also commenting in the threads. He's carrying on conversations there, which I thought was fascinating, that technology was a level setter for him. We would have difficulty carrying on a peer-to-peer conversation at school, that he was able to do that online through technology. So I kind of filed that away. And he would hang out around me. I was working in Minneapolis at the time as a creative director. I was doing some type of project in Adobe Illustrator, and he was watching me. He says, Dad, can I try that? I said, sure. So, I literally gave him 5 minutes of instruction. Here's how you draw a square. Here's how you draw a circle. Go ahead and play. So, he used it as a sandbox. So a half hour later, he calls me back and says, Dad, look what I did. And this is the character he had drawn. So this is Percy, if you know the Thomas canon. And I was like shocked. More so not because it's recognizable, but he had used tools I hadn't shown him how to use yet. So he's intuitively figured out the software to make what he wants to make. Like, I don't know that I showed him how to make a gradient, which I struggle with to this day. So I'm like, okay, here's how you download a photograph, like gave him some more instruction. And he starts making things like this, like these little funny, cartoons and things like that, that are all around his world, right? But the thing is, in the matter of 5 years, he's gone from completely locked in his own world and crossing over into mine, using professional level software, being creative, being funny, and having a great time. I can't get him off my computer now. He's on my computer all the time making things like this. So, as designers and thinkers and creative people, like, we don't know how inspiration strikes, but a couple weeks later, I go over to Margaret because she's getting her master's in special education. I said, what if we created this program where we match kids one-to-one with design professionals, allowed them to use their subject matter interest to create things? What type of wraparound support would we need and things like that? So that was where the idea for Islands of Brilliance was born. So you kind of see in these images here how the actual workshops look, where students are paired one-to-one. Originally it was with designers. It's grown into STEM professionals. We've done things around architectural modeling and things like that. So it's grown over the years as far as the different types of subjects we're interested in. But what it really comes down to is this is kind of the perfect example of our workshops, and this is pre-COVID. We've pivoted this online now, but mentor and student working together on technology. The student obviously is interested in Yoshi, so she's going to be working on a project around Yoshi. So what we see in our workshops is this deconstruction and re-engineering of existing ideas, the integration of separate and disparate ideas into new ideas, and then just completely original divergent thinking that leads to novel solutions. And we see this consistently since the beginning. So I want to share with you some examples of that right now. So in this first instance here, Aaron's subject matter interests are 3 things: SpongeBob, NASCAR, and candy. Obvious here, this one is about candy. And he's 9 years old when he did this. He walked in and 75 minutes later, this was on his screen, which for somebody like me who's been in marketing and design and advertising, I just that's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. Like, that's an ad, like, right out of the box for M&Ms. So that's, perfect example there of using your subject matter interest in a creative way. This next one we call Fashion Cat. Again, another thing done in 75 minutes. And the sense of humor and the attention to detail, whether it's there are fish on his tie and, the pocket square is actually a ball of yarn. Like, you could put a Nordstrom logo on this and it's ready to go out the door, right? When I say putting together disparate ideas, there's It and Ronald McDonald. So you get I'm Loving It. So this is a very funny, creepy, scary solution that came out of one of our workshops. If you like Legos and zombies and Andy Warhol, you will do Lego Zombie Warhol. So this is again a first-time student who had never really touched the software and did this over the course of a workshop. Very cool. This particular example, I wish everyone could spend time and see this up close. We did a holiday movie poster workshop. So this is Home Alone, done by a student, Marshall, who we call the Pixel King. And this is all the scenes in Home Alone rendered in pixel art using Super Smash Brother characters. So if you go through all those rooms, those are all the scenes from Home Alone. It's just like, so you can think about our professional creatives and designers are just totally blown away and inspired by this type of work. I wanted to put a little architecture sample in here. So those familiar with the Hancock Building in Chicago, as I have referred to it today, the Toronto of the US. This was, I think it was Jonathan's second workshop. He's had all of 6 hours time in Illustrator, never used it before. And he did this render of the Hancock. It was a side-by-side looking at a photo and then doing all these individual lines in Adobe Illustrator. So if you know the complexity of software and the level of detail in this thing, it's just remarkable how quickly our students are able to pick up and create given the technology that, often they haven't even been exposed to before. I love this example here, the marching numbers. Trinity was 7 years old when she did this. She's still a student with us. She's 16 now. She's in our Digital Academy program. So beyond this being this happy, joyful expression of marching numbers, what I want to articulate is the manner in which she did it, because it was nonlinear. She literally started with the 5 up in the corner and then would jump to the 7 and then jump to the 2. So this thing kind of came together from the edges into the center. So that nonlinear, like different way of viewing creativity and process that we see in our students, pops up often. I think this is my last example here. So Garrett is always, he's like a Geico spot waiting to happen. So that little illustration on the left is a baby who can say hello using a yo-yo string. The center is a teenage plant who likes to drink canned soda. And then there's the Triclechosaurus, which is a reoccurring character in his realm. So these like wildly imaginative ideas like that are just very inspiring, to our mentors and staff who are there to guide the students in their creativity. And this is one of the quotes from one of our professionals. So it's just, you think about what we are witnessing in our workshops and just the blue sky thinking amongst our students and how it can push the rest of us to solve and think differently around, the opportunities ahead of us. We're very excited right now because we're partnering with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on a grant with National Endowment of the Arts to create a research lab around neurodiverse creativity. Because what we see as what we've created as an intervention using creativity creates this domino effect of success. And we want to start to publish academic research around that. So we're excited about that. Next, we've launched Brilliance Studios, which is a little social enterprise offshoot of Islands of Brilliance. We're actually employing our students in projects like animation and conceptual thinking, things like that. So that's new in the last year or so. So I want to end with a couple of questions like how might we work together to establish neurodiverse talent pipeline so that these individuals who really think differently can be integrated into design-related fields. What would that lead to? I know myself as a longtime design thinker and creative director, a lot of times you need those ideas that go way out beyond the edges in order to get to new thinking. And what we have witnessed with this population is that happens every day we're with them. So how do we integrate that into our creative processes? Last, I want to finish here. This is, again, Harry's age 8 or 9. He just wrapped up his degree in design at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, graduated with honors this past December. He's working full-time, 20 hours with Brilliant Studios doing animation, then 20 hours with a company called InCheck doing data in the city. So he has inspired this movement of ours around neurodiverse creativity, and we could not be more proud of him. So I just wanted to bring the story first full circle and then end with, after seeing this presentation, please write down what your thoughts about autism are now and see the difference between the beginning and end of the presentation. And I thank you for listening. And I'm ready to answer some questions from you, Stefan. I'll stop sharing.
Mark, thank you so much. Yep. That was really moving and powerful presentation. And for starters, the I'm loving it movie poster is maybe the scariest movie poster I've ever seen. So at least pass on that. Congratulations.
We were actually at a...
I almost had to turn away from that.
We were down in, that workshop was actually done in Chicago at Ogilvy, one of the global things. And the creative director was working with this student, which is like, he was loving it.
No, and a congratulations to Harry on his graduation.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I think that, when you asked us to begin with the exercise of writing down the word autism, and then the first thing that comes to mind, the word that came to me and the one that I drew on my little piece of paper is different. And the same word occurred to me at the beginning of the presentation and at the end of the presentation, but I think I understand that context very differently now, of the breadth and scope of difference as something that can be celebrated, and that ought to be. And I was particularly struck by the creativity of the projects and the enormous range of talent on display. And I know that some of the themes that you touched on, the diversified talent pipeline, getting different types of ideas, is something that in the realm of architectural practice, something that people are always talking about. How to design for a more diverse population and with a more diverse population of designers. But it's probably something that the field, again, is sort of not really managed to accomplish that yet. But I wonder if you could tell us, in terms of the collaborations that there have been with architects and designers, how those tend to take shape and just what the process looks like.
Right. We could not have done this without the participation of what I call the creative community, and I include a lot of disciplines in that, obviously. Because when we first had the idea, it's like, people are busy. Are they going to have time? Are they going to want to do this? And it was not only a resounding yes, it was how people kept coming back to it. Because what I feel that this collaboration and relationship between the students and mentors provided this wellspring of inspiration and a reset for the professionals. And we all need that. I mean, all of us are always seeking inspiration, and more often than not, we're kind of going to the same well every time for inspiration. This provides a completely different source, and it's experiential. And what we've identified is, I think as creative thinkers, we're all kind of different to begin with, right? We're all little oddballs. So there's this kinship between the neurodiverse students and the professionals that they aren't all that different, right? So the ability to make that match, and we used to call it the Hogwarts sorting hat. We have, we find out what a mentor's interests are, and then obviously what the students are, and we try to match them that way. That the professionals are like blown away by how passionate these kids, and I call them kids, whether they're 8 or 32, how passionate they are about what they love and their ideas. And we're the same, right? I'm probably neurodiverse about pizza. So there's that. So I think when that has been like the key factor is that the co-inspiration and the co-creation between the two parties is where all the magic lies. And mentorship is such a huge component of careers in general, but for this population, to have that support and that source of self-confidence, and in a lot of ways, the mentors are like, man, you are really creative. Like that sets a student up for success in all sorts of areas. And that's what we've seen is that I don't know how many designers or 3D modelers or coders will eventually turn out. What we are trying to change is quality of life for this population. If you look at systems thinking, the beneath the surface things that then lead to better outcomes in workforce development.
I think that you mentioned the similarities between neurodivergent people and the creative professions, and in fact, most of us probably are in the creative professions neurodivergent in one way or another. I know I am. And you started with Harry's example of loving trains, which immediately made me think, written a lot and worked a lot with urban planners and urban designers, where an obsession with trains is almost a prerequisite for working in that field. So it can certainly come as, as something really helpful in your career, even though in early childhood education, we probably tend not to look at it that way. And I wonder if, for the architectural profession and for the architects working here in Canada, if they want to get involved in Islands of Brilliance, what's the best way to do so?
It's interesting because, COVID presented this huge challenge, and especially if you look at those photos from the in-person workshops where it's shared technology, we couldn't do that. But then it opened the door to virtual. So now, like I said, we've got students from all over the country, and certainly we can, as far as participation from, Toronto, Canada, like there's the opportunity for that. And we're actually looking to develop more programming around different disciplines like architecture, as a means to further or allow our students to further explore the boundaries of their creativity. And what's in it for the professionals is exactly what I'm saying. It's like tapping into this rejuvenation and wellspring of inspiration, and being around someone who thinks differently and has a different creative process that helps you understand not only your own, but then makes you think about, wow, if they're doing it this way, how does that inform what I'm doing it? So I think, as much as it is about, yes, helping students, a lot of this is about helping professionals in ways that further thinking and inspiration, and understanding difference in any number of ways.
In a way, we can't have diverse and creative design without a diverse and creative design profession.
Amen.
And I think on that, we'll connect into our last conversation, but certainly not least of the day, with the great Wanda Dalla Costa. Wanda is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona today, I think. And Wanda is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. She is an architect and an institute professor and a YBCA 100 2019 honoree, an award which celebrates people, organizations, and movements shifting culture through ideas, art, and activism. And Wanda is certainly doing that. At Arizona State University, she is the director and founder of the Indigenous Design Collaborative, a community-driven design and construction program which brings together tribal community members, industry, and a multidisciplinary team of ASU students and faculty to co-design solutions for tribal communities. Dalla Costa was part of the Unseated at the 2018 Venice Biennale, where she joined 18 Indigenous architects from across Turtle Island to share an Indigenous vision of the future. Her firm, Tawav Architecture Collective, is based in Phoenix. Welcome, Wanda.
Thank you. Let me know if you can see my screen okay.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. So I come to you from the homelands of the Akimel, Odham, and Peeposh peoples in Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you for inviting us to this wonderful talk. I'm really inspired by the speakers that have gone before. And I guess this is in the same realm of this. I work wholeheartedly in Indigenous design. But let me start with the conversation I had. So I just had a conversation with a faculty member at the University of Manitoba who happens to be Indigenous. And we were talking about the regenerative movement in architecture and how closely it aligns to indigeneity. We both teach applied coursework, which means we do projects in community and we take students out of the classroom and into the land. He made a really interesting comment that relates, I think, to this topic well. And he mentioned that when he takes both non-Indigenous and Indigenous students out on the land, many who are urban raised, they haven't developed that relationship with the land. And there is an adjustment that they have to make to what has now become a foreign environment, what you see behind. And I think for us in this today, as we're talking about the body, this is very important because Indigenous people believe that we learn about ourselves in relation to the environment or to the ecosystem. So we have a storied relationship with the land. So I grew up, just to take this into a more personal level, I grew up, visiting my grandma lots at the Saddle Lake First Nation, and the forest and the barns and the fields, that was our playground. And it continues to impact me today. Still to this day, my favorite holiday is anywhere that I call big nature. So the stretches of sky, prairie landscapes, the expanse of an ocean, changing colors, you name it. This is where I want to take me, and not only myself, but my son, who's 8 years old and is part of that increasingly urbanized generation that are losing that connection with nature and self. And so I'm really trying hard to instill that into him. And this push goes beyond the family life and into a guiding force behind my profession in architecture. So to me, when I think of a building, it is about that personal space of our body, but it is also our relationship with the outside world. And I think we all know now, after being trapped for a year and some time in our homes, how important that relationship is, right? And how it enlarges our health physically, spiritually, and emotionally. For those of you that also know my work, I think culture is also how I lead through my architecture. And so today, what I want to take you through are about 10 ideas. And the first 4 will be more of an exploration that we are currently wrestling with right now, that, as Mark alluded to, that hopefully provide different ways, different synapses that come in our brain in order to sort of shift the way we think about the world around us. I will start after that on 6 design movements that are related to our explorations that we feel really influence practice and will influence, I think, the field in the next 10 or 20 years. I hope that in what I share in this very short presentation is really an invitation to the invisible, other ways of being in the world that may help us not only build, but also bridge relationships with and to each other, collective relationships, and relationships in space. Imagination and creativity are at the heart, as you know, of artistic practice, and artists often put their capacities to work in pursuit of political and social change. When we look at the progressive movements of the last century, the settlement houses, African-American civil rights movements, our anti-apartheid struggles, we see groundswells of music, dance, visual art, poetry, storytelling, film, creative protest. Artists, whether in collaboration with political actors or simply inspired by the changing times, use their art to recruit people into a movement to reframe how we understand ourselves to the world, in relation with the world. And they help us envision new possibilities. At this time, I am in Phoenix teaching at ASU, and I work from a country that by 2045 will be a majority minority, meaning there will be more diverse people in the US than there are Caucasian people. And I think a lot about what this means for, well, not only the world, as we saw in the last election, but also for the field of design. What's interesting to me is I think this push toward diversity is creating a host of plurality concepts emerging in architecture and urbanism, perhaps reflective of the next generation and their unique demographics. But what I know is that I teach at ASU, which is a very diverse school, and they are very interested in the non-dominant narratives that shape our perceptions of the world. So this is what I teach through. What you see on screen, this is in Bolivia, and there's a waiting list for Freddie Mamani's new Andean architecture. Color, form, playfulness, extremely unique. Does it look like what we're teaching in architecture schools? Is it right? The pluriverse acknowledges and validates humanity's diversity and its interconnectedness. So that's the first concept. The second concept I want to share is called Indigenous futurity, an expression coined by Dr. Dillon. She's a professor of Indigenous Nations Studies at Portland State University. The still shot that you see on screen is part of a video that was called Imagine if Toronto Were Reclaimed by Nature. IF, or Indigenous futurity, has been described as past future visions where we construct self-determined representations and alternative narratives about our identities and our futures. It challenges the assumptions that consign Native American people and lifeways to the past, and it uses creative thinking as a pathway toward Indigenous revival. I think it's starting to emerge in many fields, from gaming to medicine and now to architecture. And the base belief, which I think is really key, is that our thoughts and our actions toward our future are important because it makes some futures less likely and others more so. The third concept I want to share with you is ethnoscapes. In the movie Black Panther, the city of Wakanda is an ethnoscape, an imaginary world which offers colonized peoples hope and vision as they see their lifelines, assets, and value systems expressed in physical form. Let me provide you an example from the art world. What you see on screen here, it's by Nicole Neidhart. She is Navajo, and it's called Remembering Futures from the Past. And I'll show you how she takes this concept and what I think it does for our field. Let me read a passage. The setting is a new world 7 generations from now. The earth has become uninhabitable, and humankind has been forced to find a new home amongst the stars. The Dene moved to a planet with 2 moons who hold the world in balance. This world is the 5th world that the Dene have lived in, the next stop in their creation story. The people terraform the planet to look like their home in Round Rock, Arizona. The Hogans are partially made of glass and woven panels. The image depicts storytellers who are remembering the creation stories and archiving them to be shared later with their community. They use a form of telepathy, with each dot representing a story from Dene history. So the piece to me shows the resiliency of Indigenous cultures, the people, and how all of that is maintained and nourished by the matriarchs of the families. They reinforce that no matter what the future we live through, we will not lose who we are. But I imagine, when I think of architecture school, imagine if this is what we taught architecture through, an ethnoscape. What would change? The fourth and final concept, before I get into the 6 more designy concepts, is the concept of lived experience. It's a representation of the experiences and choices of a given person and the knowledge they gain from those experiences and choices. My lived experience is on screen. In the bottom right, you see the forest that was our playground. Pictured in the middle, my cousins or my fellow explorers, forest explorers. And on the top right, my Cookum standing beside her outdoor washing machine. We didn't have running water. It didn't matter. What you don't see is the strawberry fields and the choke cherry bushes surrounding the home, and the fields that were restored by my uncles every season through a controlled burning. So I share this with everyone to ask them to think about their lived experience. How does it affect your practice? So let's move from plurality, futurity, ethnoscapes, and lived experience, the movements that are broad, I think, and visionary and have an opening for new ways of working, into more designy concepts. So the next one I want to show you is called Indigenous cohorts. So on screen, what you see is a chronology of universities that are starting to position themselves better to respond to Indigenous design across North America. So starting with UNM, University of New Mexico, in 2011, created an Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. We created ours in 2016, the IDC at ASU, and now Harvard is now on board in 2020. They have a group of students leading a movement. Some were initiated by students, some by faculty, but what they have in common is the aim for productive disruption in architecture and design. The next movement that I think is very important for the future of design is the incorporation of research. So in the last decade, we've seen an increase in practices that are integrating research, including our firm. We are attempting as well. It can be difficult to determine, I think, in architecture where research begins and practice begins. You know, they're very entwined. And some would argue that architects are always conducting research as their design process helps them understand a place better. For those of you that don't know, Perkins and Will now have 7 research labs. So they're focusing intensively on research. So I think as the pace of innovations quickens, demographics continue to challenge the status quo, and urgencies such as climate change continue to befall in our world. I suspect that research will play an increasingly important role in our profession. The next movement in design that I see that is influencing our practice is the notion of design as ceremony. Many of you may have heard this phrase. You might have also heard the phrase, research is ceremony, which hails from a book written by Sean Wilson, an Indigenous scholar in Manitoba. Our reservations and reserves across North America, as you see them now, have largely been created by outsiders. exogenous decision-making. Now we're in the era, often called, you've heard the term not about us without us, where we are interested in trying to reestablish ways of designing, hopefully toward better outcomes. As 18 Indigenous architects travel across Canada to all the homelands across Turtle Island, we see how closely related design and research are. There is an inquisitiveness associated with the architecture process. We go into community, we ask a lot of questions, and our questions often intersect sacred information related to protocol, knowledge systems, ceremony, worldview. The image you see on screen, if you see the word moon written, we were connecting to cosmology and the belief systems of that local community. In the book by Sean Wilson, he talks about these sort of stages of research, and I equate them to the stages of design. You know, first Indigenous people were trying to situate themselves inside of a Western framework. Then we were trying to indigenize the Western methodology, but now we realize that we have to conduct our own research based on our own worldviews and our own data collection. And I think this is really important because what it is, and I often call it a period of self-definition, but it helps us rethink the colonization. And, you know, listening to Annie and Mark, I wonder if sometimes you need to separate them and look at them separately and then put them back together to see where we end up. The fourth, or number 8 on here, which is the fourth of the last designing concepts, is the Indigenous research paradigm. Again, created by Sean Wilson. And he talks about this as 4 aspects that need to be considered when we do research and design. Can we think of these as requirements for design? I start on the East with the kind of everyday words, ways of being. What is our ways of being? In the South, our value systems. On the West, ways of doing. And in the North, ways of knowing. Together, these four form the building blocks of an Indigenous research paradigm, but perhaps indicative of a new approach in architecture. The next design-centric movement is Indigenous architecture. You know, people often ask me, can non-Indigenous people create Indigenous architecture? And yes, the answer is absolutely yes. Recently, a 7-part definition of Indigenous architecture was created by a New Zealand scholar. Very useful benchmark, I think, for all of us. We measure our work against that. Of course, we don't have time to go into all 7 parts, but I will say that it connects to recognizable genealogy, archetype, you know, inclusion of value systems, knowledges, place-based narratives, and so forth. And I think we can start to think about Indigenous design on a spectrum. Indigenous design light, maybe you hit a couple of them. Indigenous design deep, where you hit all 7 of them. And finally, number 10, Indigenous placekeeping. People often ask me what's the difference between placekeeping and placemaking, and I think they're quite similar. They're both the active care and maintenance of a place and the social fabric by the people who live and work there through arts and cultural activities. I think what Indigenous placekeeping also proposes is that it has to be led by citizen experts with lived experience. It has to align with local value systems and assets. It has to include the Indigenous research paradigm, values, being, knowing, and doing. And it has to be judged not on aesthetics or economics, but based on more holistic measures of wellness, social, cultural, spiritual, physical, and economic. What you see on screen, the 4 circles, are the 4-step journey which I teach through. Starting in the East, it's highly process-based. In the South, it's very much place-based. In the West, it's driven by reciprocity. And in the North, it must be community-led. I'll share, just to close, a few images of what placekeeping looks like to me. This is a project that we've done at Arizona State University. It was really about welcoming, using Indigenous languages, the greetings, connecting with artists, and creating spaces that Indigenous students could identify with and feel affinity with in an interior. This is a different scale in terms of architecture. This was really a scoping exercise. The site is across from the Parliament in Ottawa. It's done in association with David Fortin and Lady of Smoke. And that building is just embedded with layers and layers of meaning, including spaces for lifeways, such as this gathering space on the roof. We're also moving into urban scales. This is an urban placekeeping project in Tempe. We're trying to indigenize an entire neighborhood. We're not sure what that entails yet, but we will have the help of artists and a councilwoman to help us navigate. And finally, the last slide is, this is our studio. On the left, you see the Indigenous Design Collaborative that I run at ASU. On the right is my private practice. They have similar visions, but I think to highlight what our vision is in terms of IDC, it's really to create those field transformation ambassadors. And the mission is really to increase accuracy in the field while illuminating those undervalued and underexamined ancestral worldviews that can contribute, I think, to global change. On the right side, you see our firm. It's really an exploratory space, you know, of possibility, but our focus is really, as you see, the 5 things: Indigenous ways, participatory design, mentoring the next gen, a multi-generational approach, and earth-centered design. Hi, thank you.
Wanda, thank you so much. That was a inspirational and educational presentation, and really, I think, packed with a huge amount of knowledge for us. Right off the bat, one thing that struck me so strongly about your presentation was starting with the idea of big nature and the connection to the land. And I think that's something that throughout the world, in all types of indigenous or vernacular architecture, is sort of immediately apparent, especially in regional vernaculars. They have to respond to the land, and they have a certain intelligence in doing so. But with the spread of colonial architecture, it sort of translates the context of the empire to new contexts where those types of buildings oftentimes aren't particularly well suited to it. And I was struck by the importance of that, of connecting to the land and being in big nature. And I wonder if I can ask you, as an educator, as a professor, in terms of architectural teaching, how that's something that can be integrated into the architectural profession.
Yeah, great question. And so I think, you know, one of the things that I often share with my students is that in the Indigenous worldview, there are 4 places where knowledge comes from. You know, books is a very small one, is one of the smallest ones, but the second one is through ceremony. It's a personal sort of through visioning and ritual. The next one is through tradition, through stories, oral history. But the most important one, I think, is we can teach through at a university level is the empirical knowledge that comes from our place and from the land. You know, for example, we've been working with the Gila River Indian community here in this beautiful landscape that you see behind me, and they want to go back to adobe. And when we started to ask them why they would like to, you know, it was about the thermal performance. It was about the connection with the Mother Earth. It was about the ability to have people building their own homes. There were so many reasons why. And when I look at this, it's been really discounted. You know, we just ignore the fact that we could be 3D printing adobe homes that would be much more culturally related and also better for the environment. And we just discount it because, you know, there's a developer that needs to make money building 400 developments of homes that he tells us that there's only one way to build. And so I think this opening that when we can bring our students to the land and we can let them hear other stories of other ways of building, that just opens their mind in such a very easy way for them to begin to think in other ways and recognize other ways of building.
And it seems like such an obvious thing to do.
You would think so.
and yet it's not something that's widely practiced in the pedagogical process.
Yeah, and I'm just in one little locale here. Imagine if, you know, we do this in all the biomes in the world. What would we come up with? Our architecture would be way more interesting, I think.
And I think in that sense, there's a really strong connection between that direct connection to the land and the emphasis on research that you're talking about, and that they in fact go hand in hand quite directly.
Yeah.
And I think with that, we're going to connect all 3 of our conversations and bring back Mark and Annie. Welcome, everyone. I think it's been such a remarkably diverse and inspiring session. And I wonder if I can start by just asking each of you what something that stood out most from you and that you take away from the other presentations? And Annie, I wonder if we can start with you.
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed Mark's presentation. I think what Mark is doing is going to be, I think it brings some value to the profession in two different ways. Beyond the fact that he's creating, or he's encouraging brilliant minds to, take part into our society. I think he's creating a place for them to work, right? The studio that he's talked about. And that is something we need to think about as designers. We are designing the spaces in which people are going to work in the future. And that's something I've experienced firsthand when I graduated and I started trying to find a job. You know how many architectural offices are actually wheelchair accessible? That's not that many. Like, it's an absurdly small amount, or number rather. And so he's creating this kind of prototype for us to learn from. What does that mean to have a space in which people that live with autism can actually work and perform? And so I think that's interesting in that way. And there was another one, which escapes me right now, Mark, but anyways, you're doing brilliant work. And I love what Wanda is doing. I'm going to spend a lot more time looking at what Wanda is doing. I think there's a lot of overlaps between what I'm thinking, kind of the conversation about accessibility, how it can inform design, and what the way she's approaching it, and with Indigenous design. And one question I have for her, and maybe we can get to that later on, but I'll just throw it in there for now, is I'm curious to see, because the world of Indigenous people is so broad, right? It's so broad. There's so many different categories, if you want, that kind of falls under that general sort of umbrella. And I'm curious to see how you approach that, because it's a bit of a challenge, I think, with accessibility or universal design, where we think about someone living with a physical disability versus, a sensory disability versus a cognitive disability versus it's very hard to kind of find common ground for us to kind of start from. And so I'm curious to see how you approach that in your work. At one point, maybe we can talk about that.
No, we can take a sidebar, Wanda, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. And there's a really easy answer. We go in as if every community is a clean slate, that we take as much as we can, no preconceptions when we go into each community. And it's hard because we learn to categorize in our brain and make things easier to try and create buckets and pockets of knowledge. But we really try and wipe it clean. And our process helps us sort of open our brain to each community as a whole. And so it's really a lot of work. So we need a lot more ambassadors in this work, because it is a lot of work to research every one of the 617 in Canada and 582 in the US.
And I think that there's a great connection there to the world of accessibility, where for designers outside of these communities, it can be tempting to think of it as a checklist that you just have to check off, as opposed to a new world that you enter with each individual project and each individual context. And Mark, for yourself, in listening to Annie and Wanda, what struck you the most?
It's like this perfect storm of inspiration. For me, it's like in the past 3 months, I watched Crip Camp, which was the documentary on Netflix about the whole disability rights movement. And now, like, to be sitting here with Annie, who's like taking it even further, and she's right. It's like, it wasn't that long ago that you couldn't, if you're in a wheelchair, you couldn't get into a building. It's like, it's shocking how long this struggle has been going on, and all the challenges, that individuals face. And to be here with Annie and understanding what she's bringing to the architecture field is amazing. With Wanda, I'm like in the middle of braiding sweetgrass, and I don't want that book like to ever end. Like, I'm going to go back and read it because it's like the most awesomely beautiful book I've ever, and the way that she phrases things, and you are talking exactly the same way, how you approach your work, and different methods of research and the indigenous that we need to embrace in order to get us through what we're going through. So like to sit here and listen to both of you, it's like, oh my God, I've either been watching this or reading this, and you two are actually doing it. So this was really cool for me.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I echo that. I felt the exact same way listening to all three of the presentations. And last but not least, Wanda, what struck you about the presentations from Mark and Annie?
Well, you know what I think is hitting home right now in such a big way is that 10 years ago, we would never be having this conversation. Like, I just realized how far, I know we're still behind, but I feel like there wasn't even a thing as Indigenous architecture, let alone having someone speak on accessibility. It just wasn't a part of our conversation. And so for me, I think all of these discussions, and I wonder how many more we could add to this, you know, the anomalies that are now becoming more visible. I wonder how many other groups we could add to this, because I think what it really ties to is this notion of otherness, that there are other ways, that there is not a dominant way. There are multiple ways, a plurality in looking and designing and seeing and feeling our universe and being one with our universe. And so I think that's what it's really brought up for me, is a very, very, I think positive. This is all really, really extremely positive to be sitting in this conversation.
And I felt the same way, that one thing that sort of unites all three of the conversations together is that embrace of plurality and otherness and other ways of seeing and ways of knowing and ways of being that can all be incorporated into the world of the built environment and into the design professions. And we do have a couple of questions from the audience before we end. The first of them is for Mark specifically. And this is about the Islands of Brilliance program. The question is, have you thought about creating a program in which your kids can teach design processes to the professionals, as in reversing the roles?
We're getting there. I mean, it's amazing how, you know, at this point, like we're having our kids have always kind of led us, like where to go. But yes, we are at the point now where we want to create a model where we bring professionals in to work with our students as, you know, as a creative retreat, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening, but we actually want to bring, you know, whether it's design, creative professionals from any discipline in, just for like a 2-day workshop, you know, come in, hang out around, you know, kids who think completely differently from you, and go back, you know, recharged and rejuvenated. So yes,
the word kids was in quotation marks. In
I keep saying, well, you know, Harry's 23 now, and he's still,
oh, wow.
like, they're all kids. So I'll always, you know, being a father, I'll always call him that.
For sure. And we have a question about students and the mentorship program. And you know, the idea of mentorship, or I think for some advice that we can give to the many students watching from across Ontario, or perhaps, you know, a way we can phrase it is, if early on in something in your career when you were a student, what's something that you know now that you wish you knew then?
That you can challenge the status quo. If it doesn't feel right, it might not be right, and you should push on it. Productive disruption.
I think that's a very powerful idea. If it doesn't feel right, it might not be right.
Yeah, agreed. And I think give yourself permission to be curious about things that are not maybe trendy, or, you know, that are not at the forefront of the conversation, even in the world of academics, right? So just give yourself permission to inquire and be curious and explore. And, you know, don't judge based on result. Judge based on the process, you know, the fact that you went through the process, you've learned something along the way for sure. And yeah, so give yourself permission.
Don't be in a hurry. And have lots of hobbies and side projects. I've learned so much from gardening and the earth that's applicable to creativity and design and business. Like, pay attention to your side projects and use those learnings.
And I think this session speaks to the importance of cultivating that diversity, not just within the profession, but within each of us as individuals. And Annie, your answer really connected me so strongly to what Wanda was talking about, that something like this, a panel like this, would probably not have been done 10 years ago. And Annie, what you mentioned is that to stick with something, to stick with important ideas, even if they may not be trendy. And I know that Indigenous design, neurodivergent design, universal design, accessible design, these are all ideas that were deeply, deeply marginal to the profession a very short time ago. But I think that thanks to people like the three panelists we have with us today, that's no longer the case. And that's starting to change. And so with that, huge thank you to Wanda Dalla Costa, Annie Boivin, Mark Fairbanks, and the OAA for this conversation. Thank you so much. And I hope we all get to see each other soon.
Yeah.